If you were to read the resume and the accolades of my guest today, you would probably think he's 175 years old. The truth of the matter is he's not even 120. But Mick Garris's filmography and the things he's done are monumental. He's worked with such infamous people as George Lucas, Steven Spielberg. He's done a show with a screenplay by Preston Sturges, who's one of my total heroes. And by the way, he's also worked with Stephen King. So welcome, Mick, and thank you for being with us today. And
Thanks for having me, Peter.
let me ask you, my first question is, you're a young guy, you're about to direct a film, and Steven Spielberg says to you, you direct the film and do what you want to do. I trust you, go out as far as you can, do whatever you think is right. I won't fire you. And you're sitting there thinking, what?
Well, that actually happened to me. It wasn't a movie. It was an episode of Amazing Stories,
Okay.
which was my first job as a screenwriter. Stephen hired me to write for that series back in the 80s, the mid 80s. And so I came up with a story, and Rock O'Bannon adapted my story into the teleplay called Life on Death Row with Patrick Swayze. And Amazing Stories had a philosophy of filmmaker first. And it was not please the studio execs, it was please get name filmmakers and give them their heads, which I later did as a producer on my own show, Masters of Horror. But Stephen said exactly that to me when I was about to embark on my first episode as a director. And he said, be brave, be bold, don't be afraid of being fired because I'm not going to fire you. Now, in all honesty, I will tell you something that's quite embarrassing that preceded that. The first thing I directed when I was writing for Stephen was an episode of the Disney Sunday movie called Fuzz Bucket, which you can but shouldn't look up on Disney Plus. And it was not my best work. It was my first work for pay, but not my best. But after he saw it, he said, had I seen this first, I may not have offered you to direct an episode of Amazing Stories. So in all humility, I sit before you here telling you that he gave me that great opportunity after almost not happening because he was not impressed by the first thing I did.
What do you learn from people like, for example, you did 3 films, I believe, with Stephen King. What do you learn from a guy like Stephen King when you work with him?
Well, I've done more like 8 projects with King, features, television, things like that. Basically, what I learned from Stephen King is in a book that he wrote called On Writing, which I think is the best book on the creative process I've ever read. He says, this is how I do it. It may be helpful to you. I'm not telling you how to do it, but it's that first draft is your own. You're doing it to please yourself. You're not doing it to think about what budgetary issues there are, ratings issues there are, studio interests, commerciality. Your first draft is entirely for you, and don't share it with anybody until you've completed it, and then give it to people you trust. Because studio people are going to look for something that's just like something that preceded it and was successful. But that first draft is entirely the exercise of your unfettered imagination. And that was something that really helped me a lot and opened me up a lot.
What was it that drove you into this business, Mick?
A love for movies and television. I grew up, when I was a little boy, I watched so much television. My grandmother called me Michael Allen TV. My name is Michael Allen Garris, my full name. And I loved it. I watched it all the time. I never in a million years, even though I was born in LA and raised in the San Fernando Valley, never in a million years imagined that it was possible for someone like me to create that stuff as a living. But when I graduated junior high school, I was given an 8mm camera, pre-Super 8, for graduation present. And I just started out, I knew nothing about how movies were made, but I started out making my own little movies and kind of inventing how to do special effects and things, like doing one frame at a time to make things move around, and realizing that's how they did stop motion, by reading Famous Monsters magazine and things like that. But it is truly a passion for film and television, but also for the imaginative side of that. The ideas that I wouldn't have had on my own, that other people did, whether it's monsters or science fiction or something autre, but firmly grounded in the real world. And that's the attraction to Stephen King and why we've worked so much together. The beauty of his work is he just takes one step out of the real world and into the supernatural world. So you identify these people, they shop at Walmart, they eat at McDonald's, they live a life that we can all identify with, and they are people who are us. Now, a lot of his books are written in the first person by a writer who is a character who is a writer. And so that's contrary to what I just said, but it's just another shoe on the foot of the same man.
Mm. You know, you said two words that interest me. One of them was book, and then the other one was magazine. The culture has really changed. When you and I are basically the same age, I'm a little older than you are, but when we were growing up, the culture was a textual culture. We read magazines, we read newspapers, we read books. Now that's not the case. And film has had a tremendous influence on our culture. So comment on how you feel that is and the good and bad points of that.
Well, visual media has completely overtaken the written word.
Totally.
There are still books, there are still bestsellers, there are magazines, but print versions of the magazines are all dying off, all going under. Newspapers are going under. Literacy is something that's really important, because books are internal and film and television are external. And to be able to convey the internal in a compelling way with words that are words on a page that will never become actions on a screen is something incredibly valuable and necessary to a society. Now, if early cavemen had access to iPhone cameras, they would have made little movies rather than chiseled pictures and words into the walls of the caves.
Sure.
But they didn't. And so it created the need for literature and literacy and the ability to tell in words what you're trying to convey, because not everybody can afford to make a movie to convey a story. But stories or reality or historical events are recorded in words. Now they're recorded in pictures and all, but it is very difficult to convey internal emotional feelings or knowledge in pictorially rather than through words. I mean, I write books as well as make films and television. I'm glad I don't have to make my living doing that, because that's once again a dying medium.
Yeah.
But the telling of stories is really important. First, it was verbal, then it was taken down in words, and then it was elaborated upon to create emotional and atmospheric detail that you could not have otherwise.
I think the great link there is radio. I've always been really enamored of radio drama because as an imaginative, you know, I'll give you a personal story. As a really young kid, 3, 4 years old, I would listen to the Lone Ranger on the radio with my grandfather, you know. And then I guess 2 or 3 years later, he went on TV. It was a television show. And it was the greatest letdown I've ever had. Because, well, in a young boy who's 4 and 5 years old, you imagine the horse is 20 feet, you know, you imagine all these wonderful things. And then you actually see a man wearing a costume, and a cheap costume at that. And it was a terrible kind of thing. But radio has been forgotten now because we're so visual that form of communication is pretty much gone in the dramatic way. It's certainly on radio is a big deal, especially the AM radio.
Yeah, that's the theater of the mind. A lot of podcasts try and do that. And there will be storytelling podcasts that do it orally, A-U-R, rather than pictorially. But even still, narration is, I think, the cheap shortcut to storytelling. Now, you needed it in radio because you had to weave the pictures with words in that way. So narration was very important. But still, there's something about the written word where you're not having it interpreted for you. You are doing all the
Oh, that's a
figuring
good
out.
point. That's a really good point. Yeah.
So I think literature, books and magazines, or however you convey words on a page, I think are even more important than the long lost and vaunted radio dramas
Yeah.
of yore. But they're still trying to do that in podcasts, whether they're literary podcasts or whether they're dramatic recreations, or some of them are just telling stories, audio books, audio stories. Those are, I think, more akin. Obviously, they're the same as books because it's somebody reading a book as opposed to somebody dramatizing it.
Yeah. You know, when I grew up as a young writer, I grew up in New York on the other coast from you. We always learned as young writers, story, story, story. The story is the anchor, and you can people it any way you want to people it. But the story is the most important thing. And that's what I teach my students when I teach a screenwriting class the other semester, and I teach this production class this semester. And I always talk about story. So as a writer and as a director, and we'll get into that in a minute, how do you feel about story now? How do you interpret a story as a writer and as a director? And what's the difference?
Well, there's a big difference, and I don't know that I completely agree with you,
Okay,
because
good.
I think character. Well, for one thing, if you have writer's block, you just engage your characters in a conversation, and I've never had writer's block. Now I will from now on for saying that.
Sorry about that, Mick.
but I think character comes first. Story is
Oh,
incredibly important, and but if you don't engage with the people involved in the story, you've got nothing. Plot and story are incredibly important, but it has to be peopled by characters that are interesting, that are, if not identifiable, at least personally identifiable. They feel real. They feel like they have a history that began before the opening credits rolled and the end credits roll. Um, and you write from the inside out rather than the outside in. You write from an emotional place experientially, because no matter what your personality is, you inhabit every character that you create. So there is some of you in there, whether you want it to be or not. It has to come from someplace, and that someplace is in here or in here. Um, but story, of course, is incredibly important. But how many movies have you seen with the same plot? What differentiates the good ones
good point.
is they take you into surprising places, or they're peopled with really interesting characters you either identify with or you understand. I mean, there's a lot of use of the term identifying with characters, and that they're identifiable in screenwriting courses, and with studio executives, who are the people who take screenwriting courses more than anybody. But the idea of identifiable characters, I think, is better put as understandable characters that have a veracity to them, that feel real, that feel genuine. And so I think character is every bit as important as story, if not even beating it out a little bit.
I always think, thank you, that's differently than I think, so that's something for me to really think about. I always think that the story, the plot, is the objective and the character is the subjective. The character
Mm-hmm.
needs to be somebody I can recognize and identify with, using that word again. Otherwise, I don't want to take that trip with him. I don't believe
Right.
that I want to go on that trip with him. That's the way I've always looked at writing. And again, my writing is basically television, much more than film.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and I've done more television writing than film as
yeah,
well. But almost in equal measure, and in books too. But in each medium, there's a different requirement. Like we were talking about earlier, if you're writing a novel, you're
right.
writing that from the inside out. You're writing the musings of what goes on inside your head. And I did an experiment with that in a very unsuccessful movie I did that was also a Stephen King adaptation called Riding the Bullet. And basically, there are a lot of internal musings that go on in that novella that King had written, that to put it on the screen, I created a second character, the same character in two bodies having conversations with himself, and tried to make it a cinematic device instead of merely a literary device. So it's up to the viewer whether that was successful or not, but financially it certainly wasn't.
You know, I wasn't going to ask you this, but I think I am going to ask you this. I saw that you, I think, directed a TV piece, forget where it was from, called Polly Wants a Crack at Her. And what a title. I mean, that's a Peter Goldsmith cheesy as hell title. I love that title. It's great. Was that yours or somebody else's?
No, it was from a series called Happy Town.
Right,
with
that's
with Sam Neill and Steven Weber. And it was a work for hire. When you direct episodes of television, as you know, you are assigned a time slot, not a script, because scripts don't even exist until sometimes the day before you're shooting.
Right.
And it was shot in Toronto, and it was something that they just said, "Are you available to do this?" And I said, "Sam Neill and Steven Weber signed me up."
Right.
So Polly Wants a Crack at Her. It was. I had.
It's such a great title. I
It's
shouldn't
very
ask him.
goofy.
I thought, I might as well just ask him. What the hell? It's kind of fun. So let's do it.
Absolutely, no holds barred. Peter.
No holds barred. You know, I want to talk to you about horror films. And you said, and I'm not sure where this comes from, but it's something that I read. I actually did research because I don't know you. The other interviews, I knew everybody, so I actually paid attention, so I know a little bit here. That horror is drama plus, and I really like that. So tell me a little about that.
Well, a good horror movie has to be a good drama first, because it's got to have good characters. It's got to be engaging. A shitty horror movie is a slasher movie where it's just one murder after another, and you don't care about that. And those are valid. They're a great breaking away point for teens and adolescents to embrace something that their parents would hate. But good horror is good drama. It's good storytelling. It's good characterizations. It's something that sucks you in so you feel something. If you identify with these characters or feel empathy with these characters, you are going to feel the fear that they feel. If you, as a writer and as a director, you know how to use the mechanics, the tools of cinema to create tension, suspense, connection, all those things. So bad horror is just a bunch of viscera flung onto the screen. And as soon as you walk out of the theater, you never think of it again. Good horror is something that keeps it's what Stephen King and Clive Barker represent. Mm-hmm. Something that is identifiable, fascinating. It draws you into its web, takes some surprising turns, but that's what good drama does as well. It's through great characterizations, great storytelling, because too many people think of horror as a gutter genre. Well, Stephen King won the National Book Award because he's such a fine author, not because he's such a good horror author. And that's really important, is that you respect what you write and what you shoot and what you create. And if you don't give a horror movie the same respect as you would give high drama, then you're slumming and you're a hack.
I like that. I like that. Is the genre of horror more a director genre or a writer genre?
Well, ultimately, it's both. I mean,
has to be, but yeah.
In the best of all worlds, it's both. But it is a director's genre in that there is a surreality on top of the reality, or maybe it's a hyper reality, but it's a genre in which you can use those tools of cinema that I mentioned earlier that feel masturbatory in a comedy or in a drama or in a romance or something. You can really utilize different lenses, different colors, soundscapes, production design, performance, the techniques the building blocks of fear and tension and suspense that go back to Alfred Hitchcock in Blackmail in 1929. It has a history, and there is a wide variety of tools that is constantly expanding: digital effects, different ways to create visuals that enhance the emotional experience of a horror film that would feel entirely masturbatory or over the top, to use in a drama, for example.
Who are directors which you watch and like? Let's stay with horror for a second, and we'll move on to some other things.
Well, David Cronenberg certainly is near the top. I love, I've forgotten her name, who did The Babadook, which is a fantastic piece of work. She's an Australian director. Ty West is really great. He did X and Pearl. Pearl is one of my favorite movies of the last couple of years. And I love Joe Dante and I love John Carpenter, but we're going back now a little bit in time.
John Carpenter, yeah.
Toby Hooper. I mean, all of the masters of horror who I recruited for my series, Masters of Horror. Anybody who has a cinematic personality. There are a lot of anonymous horror filmmakers out there who remain anonymous because they may be competent or even skillful filmmakers, but they don't have a signature. You watch a John Carpenter movie, and in the first few shots, it's a John Carpenter film. And the same goes with David Cronenberg and people who have a cinematic personality, and that's something to really aspire to.
We talk about Alfred Hitchcock. I think Hitchcock said, and correct me if I'm wrong, directing is 70% casting.
Yeah, I think
is that correct? I think it's right.
I think it might have been even more than 70%,
okay.
but
okay.
certainly around there.
Yeah.
But that's really true, except in the case of the genre or specialized genre, science fiction too, which I'm not as much a fan of science fiction as I am in horror that's really grounded, because science fiction is a little less grounded in what the world that we live in. But those tools of building horror, which Hitchcock was one of the inventors of,
sure.
The bathtub, the shower scene in Psycho,
yeah,
was basically a symphony of tension. He created all these pieces, over 50, let's see, what is it, 57 cuts in that sequence.
In that scene, yeah.
Yeah. So it's definitely important on the director's end, because you can express yourself cinematically in a more florid way than you can in other genres.